Because you look at what he is doing now, in some sense, this is like...
Welcome back to the Are We OK podcast, the podcast that talks about public policies and politics in ways that are relevant to you. Peter or Mr. Money is still out of commission because last week he has conjunctivitis. This week he has a sore throat. He's just sitting off camera. He can't speak too much. I'm Mr. Botak or Dr. Botak, and we have a special guest with us today. He is none other than Professor Wong Chin Huat from Sunway University. One of our listeners asked to invite on the show today. So what you ask, we will try to deliver as much as possible. So welcome Chin Huat to the show.
Thanks Kian Ming and Peter for inviting me, and thanks for your listener who requested my presence.
Okay, great. So before I ask you to introduce yourself, Peter did some Googling just now, and one of the things that popped out when he Googled your name was in reference to a quote from Churchill that you are associated with or you agree with, meaning this quote is Churchill was right. Why is that quote associated, or why does it resonate with you?
I think that quote was about that Churchill say, if you were to throw stone at every dog that barks at you, you'll never get to your destination. It's a reminder to me that when not to fight back. Because you should choose your battle, spend your time on more productive things. There are people that you need to debate with. There are people you should just ignore.
Okay, so I think that's a good place to start, because Chin Huat, you are known as somebody who is not just an academic, but would you say that you are like an activist academic? Would that be
I am advocates on many issues, yes.
And is that also one of the reasons why you are always seen wearing black, like today?
I did not wear black since I was a kid. It started in 2009, exactly I think February 6th, around Chinese New Year. That was the day that the Perak state government collapsed because of all we know, the crossover of three Pakatan Rakyat Assembly person. But I wasn't wearing black in protest of that. I was protesting the palace decision of not allowing new election. So my point then was like, this is a majority government. If a majority government collapsed, then you have to allow for fresh elections. If it's not a majority government, that's a different story.
Okay. Have you been wearing black since then, or
Basically.
Was there ever a point in time, let's say, maybe after the 2018 elections, when you gave yourself leeway not to wear black because maybe part of the journey had been complete at that time?
Not at all. I only changed my color temporarily to yellow during birthday rallies. But the question you ask is actually very pertinent. People do ask me and say, after 2018, why do you change it? I say the original reason I wear black was because there was not an elected government in Perak after 2009. Going by that logic, I should stop after 2013, right? Because you have a fresh election. The next government was actually duly elected.
Yes.
So the reason that why I continue, of course, is after 2013, I changed my goalposts. I see no reason of me stopping my protest, but I extend my protest against the entire political system. I see a system that actually suppressed dissidents, competition, most importantly, competition. And so I work towards that. Now, I'll change my color. I probably get so used to wear black, but if there is a day that I should change my color and I don't change my clothes, I'll dye my hair. So I'll make that promise now. I'll dye my hair, at least some part of it. In what occasion? We managed to move away from our first past the post electoral system.
To a different kind of electoral system.
Yeah.
Okay.
It doesn't mean that throw it out completely.
Sure.
But there should be some fundamental changes.
Okay. Yeah, we can talk about that later on when we talk about institutional reform. Do you want to introduce yourself to the audience for those who may not know your background, where you're working at now?
Officially, I'm the Deputy Head for Strategy at the Asia Headquarters of UN Sustainable Development Solution Network, SDSN, at Sunway University. I'm a professor at the university, a political scientist by training. I got my PhD from the University of Essex in UK. in the UK, the relationship between electoral system and party system in West Malaysia from 1982 to 2004.
Yeah, and I think we've known each other for more than 20 years, right?
Yes.
Before I went to do my PhD, before you went to do your
Exactly.
PhD,
Yeah.
I was working in a couple of think tanks at that time, and we've had quite a number of back and forth and discussion on different issues to do with electoral systems. And I have to say that Chin Huat is one of the people that has been very, very consistent in his advocacy for electoral reform in ways that I think are very pro greater electoral competition and fair competition, especially with regards to the translation of votes into seats.
Yes.
Right? Which we'll talk about later. So yeah, maybe for the first part of the discussion, Chin Huat, I'd like to talk about institutional reform first under this Madani government, and then the second part we can go into a more technical issue or area, which is the redrawing of boundary lines. That is the exercise supposed to start soon. So maybe I can start with institutional reform, something that we are quite passionate about, especially in the political realm. Where are some of the highlights and lowlights that you've seen under this Madani government since 2022 in the area of institutional reform in the political landscape?
Well, if you're looking at the positive parts, there's a lot of things. The very recent one, even though it's partial, is the amendment to the federal constitution that allow children born to Malaysian mothers overseas to automatically gain citizenship. But unfortunately, that constitutional amendment also tightened the provisions for stateless.
For those people who have been born in Malaysia to parents who did not have proper documents, it's very, under the constitutional amendments, it's much harder for them to apply for citizenship.
Exactly. And many of those are actually natives from Sabah and Sarawak.
Especially Sabah.
Yeah. Because many of them do not have those documents.
Okay, so yeah, I would agree with you. I think that's something that's definitely positive, especially for children of Malaysian mothers, children that were born overseas. That's one. Any other positives that you can think of?
I would have to give the credit to Azalina for starting the move on separating our public prosecution from the Attorney General Chamber. But unfortunately, that process took quite a long time. There's no guarantee that this would actually be completed before the government's terms end.
And she has said that, recently I read in a report, she said that the government is in no hurry to try to implement this reform.
This is exactly the problem. I think that one of the key points to define this government, how reformist it is to look at whether we can complete the agency reform. Now here I want to quote a mutual friend of ours, Andrew Yong, who said that
who's a lawyer by
who's
training.
a lawyer who's now in UK. He wrote a very good report on agency reform for Bersih, and he made this very pertinent point. If any criminals can actually overturn their convictions by changing the government, hence changing the Attorney General, no government would be stable. Because whoever have committed grave crimes but have political clout would then try to overthrow the government.
So that he or she can replace the Attorney General to one that's more favorable and have the cases against him or her drop.
Either drop DNA or DNAA or simply make stupid legal mistake. So to lose that case in the court.
Yeah. So just to explain to our audience, what we've been talking about with regards to the separation of roles here is separating the role of the Attorney General's chambers or office into the part where they advise government on different legislation, different constitutional amendments, the legal part of that role, versus the prosecutorial part, whereby the Attorney General's chambers has the right and also the responsibility of, charging people for different criminal, offences, right? Yeah. Whether it is in the area of, robbery, murder, corruption, and so on and so forth. So that is the area where we see that, the intentions are good, but it's a little bit stuck at this point in time.
And looking at how the recent court decision on the withdrawal of Zahid 47 charges, right? DNA. And I would say that we probably need to talk about constitutional amendment to allow the AG's decision to be challenged in court.
Okay.
Because currently it's completely no go.
At the discretion of the Attorney General.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. So there isn't an avenue for some sort of a public interest appeal when the former Deputy Prime Minister Zahid Hamidi was discharged, not amounting to an acquittal, over 47 charges of corruption. I'll maybe add a few more in terms of what I think this government has done from a institutional reform perspective. I think one that I'm fully supportive of is the changing of the legislation to abolish the mandatory death penalty. So the death penalty is still there for certain offences, but the judge has leeway, has flexibility in not imposing the death penalty, but have different sorts of longer sentences for different kinds of offences. So I think that's one. The fact that we have much more robust debate now in Parliament for, let's say, the Suhakam Human Rights Report. Sometimes when the government has time, Parliament has time, even debating some of the Auditor General's findings in Parliament. Those things didn't happen in the past. They have it now. And then also, I think, some attempts at wanting to make MACC more transparent and accountable, although for these things, sometimes action speaks louder than words. Maybe move on to the sort of like downsides then.
Yeah.
Where do you think are some of the gaps in this Madani government with regards to institutional reform?
There are many of them, but I want to underline three very important ones. One is parliamentary reform itself. As you mentioned, that our parliamentary debate now is more robust. However, it's far from optimal. The second is political financing bill. The discussion has started since Najib time. We have had this is the fifth Prime Minister talking about it, but there's no sign that this would happen next year or before GE16. Then the third one is very obvious. What Pakatan Harapan promised in its own manifesto, fair allocations for constituency development to all MPs regardless of their party affiliation. That is not happening. Instead, that has been denied as a way for the Prime Minister to entice opposition MP to support him. So the three things that I think fundamentally problematic. I want to talk a little bit more about parliamentary reform. The first thing what people talk about is that the delay in getting the Parliamentary Service Act enacted.
Yeah, to give Parliament a more independent civil service, so to speak.
Yes.
Because right now they are recruiting from the other parts of the civil service.
And of course the issue is complex, but I think what is problematic here is that there's no transparency, that we do not know whether the delay is really because of bottleneck in negotiation or it is
lack of political will.
Exactly.
Yep.
Right. Now, but the larger issue here is that what role does our parliament have to play in check and balances to the executive? Let's start with the time that our parliament meets. Now, if you count from 20 years, ending on 2019, that's mean just before the COVID-19, our parliament met for an average of 60 days a year. Now that's very short. If you compare, basically most of our parliamentarians, the rule being in session is
the exception rather than
the rule, yes. Right? But in other country, you actually most of the time parliamentarians or the congressperson
you expect to be in parliament
would be in the parliament or in the congress. It's only then you have the recess. I think former Speaker Tan Sri Arif did talk about extending it to about 100 days eventually, but we are now still talking about less than 70 days. There's no commitment shown from the Prime Minister that he wants a more full-time parliament.
I think Chin Tong has also talked about how we can extend the number of days in parliament and have more specialized debates, have more of the parliamentary committee, select committee sitting and whatnot.
Yes, so. And select committee is another thing that we have to look at. Currently, we have 10 select committees. Each of them have 9 members, so you're talking about 90s, right? You exclude the 54 MPs who are in front benches or the deputy speaker, and then you look at the 90s, and then another 13 for the Public Accounts Committee, right? We have around 30% of MP left without any
post.
Now that's problematic. And why so, right? I would argue because the government is not interested to allow most of them of this 30% who are left behind, most of them are opposition MPs. The government is not interested for the opposition MPs to play a role in policy, in scrutiny.
In the check and balance.
In the check and balance. Okay. And the problem then, and we look at the committees, for example, the one in charge of infrastructure, that one cover public works, transportations.
Probably, things like airports and
So they
highways and things
they
like that.
care about 3 or 4 ministry. And how can a 9-person committee actually solve that?
Yeah, so you're asking for more parliamentary committees.
Yes, I think that's one. Another thing is like, if this government always complain that the oppositions are harping on them on the 3R issues. Now, but if the opposition were to contest against you, how would they compete with you? They would have to compete on something, right? If you do not want them to compete on 3R,
give them more policy responsibilities.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the government should actually recognize shadow cabinet. Recognize the opposition shadow cabinet. For me, I would say pay them like what they do in Australia. Give them 1/3 of the ministerial pay. Not talking about anything else or other perks, just a pay. So they get about 5,000. Now, some people would say the opposition's shadow ministers have no competence, no qualifications to enjoy this. For me, that's a question of chicken and egg.
Yeah. They have to prove that they have the competence and let the people judge for themselves.
And actually, once you pay them, you raise public expectation on them.
Correct.
If they do not live up to the expectation, next time when we complain about a stupid minister, we would ask, how about his or her counterpart in the shadow
opposition.
cabinet? Right?
Yeah.
Would that person do a better job?
Okay, so on this part, I can tell you for a fact that when we were in the opposition, we meaning Pakatan Harapan and before that Pakatan Rakyat, this would not have been feasible because number one, I think the government wouldn't be willing to play ball. Number two, there was a deep reluctance in terms of trying to name people to these positions because at that time was the expectation that suddenly you name too many non-Malays into the shadow cabinet, then you'll be attacked and all that. But I think given the fact that the opposition now has already named different people to different portfolios, it's basically a Malay opposition now, a totally Malay opposition. That this would probably be a good time to put that into place so that you set the structure right for the future as well. And then, like you say, the public can see the performance of these individuals who have been allocated certain shadow cabinet positions.
Exactly. I mean, then we would ask, what do they do? I think this is actually for the best self-interest of the government, because how can you ensure a front bench of 60%, none of them is idiot? It's impossible, right?
Yep.
When you need to form a coalitions that catering to different kind of categories, parties, states, ethnic groups, gender, age group, and so on, you're bound to be some appointments that are not up to par.
Yep.
If you have a comparison in the shadow cabinet, people become more realistic.
Yeah, and I think people will pay attention more to who is the shadow cabinet for what position. Right now, I think very few people know who the opposition has nominated to their own shadow cabinet. People probably know that the head of the opposition is Hamzah Zainuddin because he gets a lot of airtime. But I don't think people would know that, for example, Saifuddin Abdullah has been asked to look after the education portfolio. Razi Jidin has been asked to look after the finance portfolio. Wan Ahmad Faizal has been asked to look after the foreign affairs portfolio. And that's because there's no public recognition for this. Then now we can go to the area of political financing. Maybe we can tie it in together with the issue of constituency allocation, because the two are linked.
Sure. At the end of the day, we have to acknowledge this, that politicians do not just compete on policy. Often they compete on patronage. You like it or not, you call it service, whatsoever. People ultimately look for that, right? So especially when our parliament is not functioning properly, ordinary people would not believe that what their MPs say in the House matters so much. What they care is, what do you bring back to the constituency? And for rural constituency, that could be like even ATM machine, right? So this is the part where not allowing the oppositions the chance to have any money to service their constituents eventually would weaken them, either to defect or to lose elections. But there is a qualification here. It would not hit all opposition's MP with equal strength. The one who get hit most would be the moderate. Because if you are a hardliner, you are a champion, a rebel-rouser, you can easily position yourself as a strong alternative to the government. Some of the voters would say, yes, we are voting in the opposition. We don't need you to do anything. You survive, right? However, if you are moderate, then it becomes your distinction from the government would not be so obvious. So when you don't have money, you lose out. So some of them may jump to the government side, but what overall the effect of this is that you create a very nasty
environment
and opposition in the hope that they will become unelectable. But what happens if they're electable? You would have people who basically are not equipped with the ability, the competence, the knowledge, or the preparation.
So ironically, by not allowing the opposition equal constituency allocation, which is something that Pakatan Harapan had been fighting for, for the longest time, and also, having this kind of MOU that says you cannot, quote unquote, touch the 3R issues, right? You are actually not encouraging the opposition to be more responsible.
Exactly. And I think that it's perfectly legitimate for the opposition not to sign this draft MOU because it's basically a surrender note. If I'm the opposition, I sign this, I basically say all the 6 Bersatu turncoats were right. We basically did what they have done, right?
Yeah.
So that's bad. What it come back to this is what we need for the government, what the government should do if you really want to reduce the salience of 3R in our politics, you have to give room for the opposition to compete in policy matters and also in patronage.
Okay.
You get a level playing field, then some of the moderate will survive. Notice that those who jump are mostly from Bersatu. Or in the past from UMNO, hardly from PAS.
Yep. So I think the other thing about maybe highlighting Bersatu, many of them also in states which they are not the state government of as well.
Yeah.
Right. So I think that maybe increases their incentives to want to look for constituency allocation. Maybe I can sort of like jump to the next relevant topic under this first part.
Yeah.
Which is the obstacles towards greater institutional reform, including, for example, equal constituency allocation and political financing. Do you think the obstacles or the sort of like resistance is coming from UMNO within the Madani government or maybe GPS, or do you think it's coming more from even Anwar himself because he doesn't want to rock the boat?
Now, these very good questions. I think in the short term is that Anwar is so afraid of his survivor. He still fear the Sheraton move, the spectre of the Sheraton move, thinking that his government may not be able to survive. So he wants to achieve that. But the longer term is that if his government gets so strong, he may not be interested in actually more reform. For simple reason that he might think that dominance will allow him to do
anything he wants.
To do. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the problem, I think, there's certainly resistance from UMNO. Some UMNO politicians still think that how can we give money to the opposition because then they will win our elections, right? Will beat us. There would be resistance from some civil servants who do not want to be called by MPs to the parliament to testify and so on. But these are not the main reason. The main reason, you will look at the case of Constituency Development Fund, where we talk about all this allocation. The biggest obstacle is none other than Anwar himself, because there's no one would attack you for giving money to the opposition, right? That why he doesn't want to do it? Why is he not interested in political finance bill? There are two parts of that. Now, tightening, we do not have any laws regulating political finance. That's why we have one MDB. The only thing we have is in the Election Offences Act that capped the expenses for a candidate in a parliamentary contest to 200,000 and in a state contest at 100,000.
Yeah, which is not really very realistic. Yeah, but that's another topic. Yes,
exactly.
Yeah.
So, but come back to this. Why wouldn't Anwar do something about tightening this? right? Why don't we even talk about giving public funding to the political parties? So officially, we give money to the political party so that they do not have to be so dependent on private funders.
So let me propose this to you, since you brought up the issue of Anwar being one of the main obstacles behind this. Do you think it's possible that this is the Anwar that is the political animal at the heart of his character? Meaning, all the talk about institutional reform, reformasi after 1998 and all that was only because he was in the opposition. Once he's in power, once he has tasted being the Prime Minister, he wants to use political leverage and the tools of being in power to try to expand and continue his political influence.
I think that hypothesis is very plausible. I want to frame it in another way. The question here is that can Anwar outgrow his mentor, Mahathir? Because you look at what he is doing now, in some sense, this is like a benign version of Mahathir. He wants to have the power to be more dominant, but have more progressive ideas and so on. Because ultimately, what defined Mahathir, other than his view on ethnic politics, as corruptions and so on, is this obsessions with dominance, is this distrust with competition.
Yeah, so wanting to have that political power and hold it for as long as he
exactly. And this is the things that we are not seeing any talk of secession. Anwar is not young, right? But you're not seeing that. Are we going to see another crisis at the end of his second term, perhaps, right?
If he becomes Prime Minister for the second term. Some people may say, okay, this is maybe who Anwar truly is. Some people may be more generous to say that, he needs to do this in order to stay in power and maybe even to have a second term, including trying to weaken the opposition. Of course, that's a dangerous strategy because you may find yourself back in opposition. But some people are saying DAP is the party that has a much longer history in terms of championing institutional reform, right? One of the reasons why I joined the DAP is because I felt that the leaders were committed to push through the agenda of institutional reform, including people like Lim Kit Siang, for example. But now you don't really see the same kind of push. Why do you think that's the case?
I think DAP is stuck in a dilemma how to be a partner in the government that is not MCA. Because the role that people imagine that you would have to be MCA, and of course DAP know that you can no longer shout from inside, otherwise you break the government. Already this government is being accused of dominated by Chinese, by DAP and so on.
Less so compared to PH 1.0, but I know where you're coming from.
Yep. Yeah. So, but that does it mean that DAP cannot actually have any role to play? I think it comes back to the questions whether DAP would draw any red line. The default situation looked like there would be no red line, meaning that because the DAP has been mandated by the minority and liberal voters, it sees a need for it to continue being the government, to keep this government afloat. And therefore, Anwar could use this to say, whatever you do, you cannot leave this government. You cannot object to us. Your hands are tied. And then to make this very convenient is the fear of pass, the green wave. But I think what we are seeing from the Makota by-elections, the Sungai Bakap by-elections, is that DAP does not own the Chinese vote. This is unlike PAS own is Malay's vote, the Islamist vote. The old UMNO own the Malay nationalist vote, right? For different way. One is wala, loyalty. The other one is sort of obligation because we utang budi to you. DAP doesn't own the Chinese vote. Because the Chinese are not wala. They're not loyalists to DAP. And they were the one who held DAP into power rather than they count on DAP for benefits and...
But some may say, this in all these by-elections, the non-Malays, especially the Chinese, are still supporting DAP and the unity government, the Madani government, at rates of over 80%.
True, but what you have to look at is actually the percentage of turnout.
Okay.
So instead, there's no way that an ordinary non-Muslim liberal would actually support PN, right? But their options is PAMU, Parti Aku Malas Undi. So I just stay back home. Now, if enough of DAP base stay back home in the next elections, DAP would probably left with about 60% of its current seats.
Probably the bigger loser would be PKR
and Amana. They will be close to whiteout.
Okay, so that I think is a good place for us to end this first section. I'm sure you guys will have a lot more comments to put with regards to other areas of institutional reform that may have been neglected by this Madani government. We'll come back after this and talk about the delimitation exercise. Be right back. Welcome back to the Are We OK podcast with our special guest, Professor Wong Chin Huat from Sunway University. So the first part, we've talked about the areas of institutional reform, some of the things that the Madani government has delivered, and some areas where we still see major gaps. And one of the areas of perhaps I would say is a major gap is in the Election Commission, which is in charge of the delimitation exercise, where every 8 years, the Election Commission is tasked with the responsibility of redrawing constituency boundaries and perhaps also increasing the number of parliament and state seats. So maybe Chin Huat, you can explain to the audience, why do you think it is important for there to be an independent Election Commission, especially at the chairman level, to ensure that the delimitation exercise can be conducted in a fair and transparent manner?
Well, Elections Commissions is in charge of, other than conducting elections and managing the electoral, in drawing the constituency. So this is the part that, if, like as we've seen in the past, you can have your former constituency, Bangi, having about 300,000 voters, as compared to Sabah Benam. Within the same state, there's about 50,000, 6 times. Now that is the fault of the EC. Going back to how they draw the constituency, this is not what the Constitution provide for, because in subsection 2C, it says that constituency within the same state have to have approximately equal numbers of voters. So if you do not have an EC that acts independently, of course you would see things like this happen, and then you have to count on the court to challenge it. But unfortunately, in the past, cases regarding constituency delimitation has been thrown out by the court by different judges on different grounds. So back to this, what's the problem with the EC is that traditionally it has been filled with retired civil servants who have been habitually accepting orders from politicians rather than act independently from politicians. So we need to change this. We need the appointment of the EC, not just the chairperson, but all the other members, to be scrutinized by parliamentarian in the select committee, that because you would have then a multi-partisan line up in the committee to check through. So someone who is obviously too biased would not get a chance to survive.
Okay, right? So I want to draw our listeners back to 2018.
Yeah.
Whereby after the 2018 elections, with Mahathir coming in, the Election Commissioner at that time, who was a former civil servant, he, if I'm not mistaken, he voluntarily stepped down. That, I think, was sort of like a recognition that, new administration, so you probably want new people. Although in the case of the Election Commission chairman and the commissioners, you can't actually sack them. Right,
yeah.
It is they are appointed there by the Agong on advice of the Prime Minister, and then the other members of the commission also stepped down. And what happened was that Mahathir, he didn't go through the Parliamentary Select Committee. He didn't go through any sort of like scrutiny on the part of Parliament, but he did appoint non-civil servants to the commission, right. And he also appointed a non-civil servant as chairman, Art Harun, who became the speaker later on after Sheraton moved, right? And all those commissioners, I think that were appointed by Mahathir, those that have not turned 66 are still there. We know some of them, people like Azmi Sharom, and then also Zul Randawan, formerly from Bersih. Yeah. And then a few others, including an academic friend of ours as well. Yes.
Faisal.
Faisal. So they're still there. So when there was an opportunity for Prime Minister Anwar to appoint a new EC chairman, because the former one, had turned 66, that's when they have to retire. Bersih asked for certain things to be done, right? Including, a list of candidates to be tabled to the Parliamentary Select Committee. I myself said certain things. You also said that to support that point of view. But none of that was done.
Now, and this is less excusable compared to Mahathir's time, because at the time when Mahathir came into power, when he appointed Art Harun as the EC chair, we may not even have PSSC on elections.
Yeah, the Parliamentary Select
Because
Committee.
that came much later. So you don't have a structure, but today we have the structure. So Anwar has no excuse of not to do so, right? And the whole question here is like the current chairperson seems to be someone quite determined wanting to make a change. But who can guarantee that others, his successor would be the same, right? Ultimately, we need a system We need a process that ensure we get the best, at least not the worst. But currently, you count on luck.
So so far, I don't really I've not really seen any important public statements that have been made by the new EC chairman, who is a former civil servant, with regards to how he wants to modernize or have a more reform-minded approach towards conducting elections in Malaysia, including the delimitation exercise.
Yeah. I have not seen anything formal, but I understand that there were efforts in modernizing it, because I did ask about what about electoral data access, which our interest, right?
Yes.
I was told that maybe we could expect something next year.
So let's focus on the delimitation exercise. The delimitation exercise takes place once every 8 to 10 years. And just to explain to the audience, the last delimitation exercise for Peninsular Malaysia was completed in 2018.
Yep.
If I'm not mistaken, around February or March. I was in the hall trying to debate that, and I got shouted down by the UMNO MPs. And that was the cause of how Bangi became, Serdang became Bangi and became the largest, went from the second largest to the largest constituency in Malaysia. All those things that you talked about in terms of discrepancy in the size of the constituencies, something that political scientists know as malapportionment, was accentuated under the 2018 delimitation exercise. So the new delimitation exercise will only start in 2026.
Can only start.
Okay,
Not
can only
will.
start. Okay,
Yeah.
you want to explain
Sure.
the
Okay.
difference?
Now, in the past, our constitution laid down that you cannot change the constituency boundary less than 8 years, and you cannot not to do anything after 10 years unless you have ground to say there's no need to change. In other words, you have to study. But then the upper limit of 10 years have been removed. So basically what we are looking at it now, that if the numbers of constituencies stay the same, you can only change it after 8 years since the last exercise. The last exercise was not when it was approved. It was when the report was submitted to the Prime Minister. So the date we are looking at for Sarawak was since last August. For Sabah, next Valentine's Day. For Semenanjung, March 2026. So until then, you can only start. Now, I want to come back to one point earlier you mentioned about that the EC is actually in charge of deciding the numbers. This is actually not in the case. The numbers of seats is
Specified in
governed
the
by
Federal Constitution.
Article 46. It's actually parliamentarians who make that. But in the past, under BN Thai, I know what happened was that BN parties would go to the EC and say, we want some seats here and there. Then EC would make sort of a case, would then bring to constituency delimitation. Actually, what happened in the past was very fishy and unlawful. They would draw the constituency map first, get you into that process without changing Article 46.
Which specifies the total number of parliamentary seats, also giving the breakdown by state.
Exactly. So, for example, in 2003, when the Selangor constituencies were changed, right, the EC presented the map for 22 parliamentary constituencies.
From 17 to 22.
But Article 46 remained at 17.
Yeah.
They make the changes after that. Why this particular point is important? Because by the time everyone passed through that, it's not just about that process has been completed. You have got a buy-in. People psychologically settle with the new map. Then no one debate that why, when 20 seats were added to the whole peninsula, Selangor only got 5 instead of 10 that it deserved. Why Johor gets 6 instead of 4? Right? So that's really the problem that we deal with, and that's a seat increase part.
Okay, so from sort of like a more transparent and objective perspective, if let's say you were the Election Commission chairman and you had sort of like oversight into how this delimitation process is to be done properly, what would the ideal process be like for you? Should the number of seats be increased at the parliamentary level first, and then only you do the delimitation exercise?
The size of the parliament should not be my concern at all as an EC.
Okay.
Because that should be the parliamentary speaker and parliamentarian concern. They decide how big the parliament should be, and that you have to take into account what jobs that parliaments are going to do, including how long you're going to meet, how many committees, and all those things. Those will be the reason you should consider, right? As an EC, my job is that if this is a number, then I should draw the constituency. But this is a point. we shouldn't have Article 46(2), which actually give the number, say, 22 Selangor, 26 to Johor. This was changed in 1962. Before 1962, we have Article 116, Clause 3, that actually allocate the seats based on the percentage of voters to the states, as long as it don't run too far from the percentage of the population.
So you have one number, and at that time I think it was 104 before Sabah and Sarawak came in. And then, 104 was because there were 52 constituencies that were divided, split into two.
Yeah.
So from the 104, you should be able to use some sort of number of voters formula to be able to allocate those seats.
Yes.
But, currently we have Article 46. We can't change that. So, if let's say you were the Election Commission, 2026 March comes, the redrawing of boundaries has to start.
Yes.
Right? So, if let's say that was the case, you would have to start the exercise, and you would have to make some sort of assessment as to the number of seats that you want to add in each state based on whatever formulation you think is fair. Correct?
Okay. Yeah. So I would abide by the 13th schedule in the Federal Constitution, which says that the constituency have to be drawn with approximately equal numbers of voters. Yeah. It also say that if a certain constituency you have a large landmass, then you can give them allowance.
Rural weightage, they call it. Yeah.
Actually, it's area weightage.
Okay, area weightage.
Yes. The difference is that you could have rural area that is not very large, well connected. Then there's no ground for you to actually give them smaller numbers.
So, for example, the northern part of Selangor, right? Although people say that it's rural, but it's actually very well connected.
Yes. In fact, that you look at the smallest one, Sabah Benam, it's much better connected than Ulu Selangor. But Ulu Selangor has twice the size of Sabah Benam.
Okay.
More than twice the size. So the exception would only be legitimate for places like Gua Musang, Greek. Right? We are not talking about elsewhere. Now, with that, the second thing I would look at is actually they have to maintain the local ties. So you cannot draw a constituency cutting across. For example, Sungai Buloh span across 4 local authorities: Selayang, Petaling Jaya, Shah Alam, all the way to Kuala Selangor.
And I think Damansara in PJ as well also spans, if I'm not mistaken, 4 local authorities. Right. So there are certain rules that have been specified in the 13th schedule.
Yeah.
But the 13th schedule is also silent on things like area weightage, right? So then I think your approach would be, I look at it on a state-by-state basis, and then I determine, and try to reduce the inequalities, within the states. But we still have this question with regards to how many seats do you want to allocate to Selangor based on the number of voters in Selangor versus the number of seats that you want to allocate to, let's say, Pahang.
But you see, this come back to Article 46. Currently, the EC chair would have no power to do this. So in order to do this, we need to restore Article 116 Clause 3.
Okay, but let's say you can't do that.
Yeah, we can't do that. So we basically just draw it. So
you would draw it based on the current number of seats in Selangor.
Exactly.
So that means 22 seats, you will maintain the 22 seats.
Exactly.
Okay.
So what it means is that if you look at the numbers of voters in GE 15, every seat would have approximately 67,000 voters.
So if that's the case,
Pahang would have 81,000.
So you would reduce the level of malapportionment or discrepancy within a state like Selangor, but you won't reduce the disproportionate differences in size between Selangor and, let's say, Perak, for example.
The good example is Pahang. Pahang is 81,000.
Okay.
So it's less than half.
Okay. Yeah. So that would be something that you think is still within some sort of a reasonable limit.
That is a problem that we can only overcome by abolish Article 46(2) and restore Article 116(3).
One more thing that I want to bring up that perhaps our audience doesn't realize is in the past, because BN has always been dominant, all the gaps and all the problems related to the delimitation exercise, including some aspects of the federal constitution, haven't really been highlighted or exposed.
Right.
Now, with changes in government, not having 2/3 majority at the federal and the state levels, we see some of these things happen. So, for example, if let's say you have a situation where the Election Commission says, okay, my proposal to Parliament is to increase the number of parliament and state seats by X number, right? Let's say I want to increase parliament seats by 10 in Selangor, and then state seats by 20. You could have a situation whereby the government of the day has a 2/3 majority in the federal government, but does not have a majority or control of the state legislature. Right, so that case doesn't apply to Selangor, but it would apply to a place like Kelantan.
True, but they come back to this whole question that EC really has no business in telling seat increase.
Okay.
Because that's really a parliament and the state legislature power. If a state decide they want to, for example, Terengganu or Kelantan, they want to increase their number of seats, they can. Okay. And the moment they do so, they are not bound by the 8 years limit. Yep. So the delimitation process on the areas affected will start immediately within 2 years.
Okay, so this is an important point for our listeners to understand. The Terengganu, Kelantan, Selangor state government can go out there and say, look, I want to increase the number of state seats, and this will be a constitutional amendment at the state level. And then the Election Commission is bound to redraw the lines to increase the number of state seats.
Yes.
The only thing that will hold the Election Commission back would be it cannot increase the number of parliamentary seats.
Exactly. Because unless the parliament does so because our state constituencies are nested within the parliamentary constituency, so when you change a state constituency, you also change the parliamentary constituency.
Yeah. Okay. So this again another technical point that I think our audience needs to realize. Yeah. This is more of the politics. If let's say in the past before 2018, the Selangor state government is controlled by Pakatan Rakyat, later on Pakatan Harapan. Federal government controlled by BN. If the Selangor state government were to say, I want to increase the number of state seats by X number, right? But because the Election Commission is controlled by the federal government, BN, the Selangor state government is powerless in terms of being able to influence how the Election Commission would likely draw the boundaries in ways that are detrimental to the interests of Pakatan Harapan.
Actually, it's not.
Okay?
Actually, it's not. The reason because that now the state government control its own business through the state constitution, right? So the state government can actually move amendment to the state constitution and then define how the lawmakers are representing the people. Okay. The only thing they cannot say is they cannot touch the word constituency. But you can say, for example, we have 56 in Selangor.
Yes.
You want to increase this to 60. And then you say, every state assembly person, they have to represent a certain percentage of voters. 1 divided by 60 plus minus what percentage, right?
Yeah. So the deviation cannot
confine it. You cannot touch the word constituency. The moment you touch the constituency, you become unconstitutional.
Okay, yeah. All right, so there's these kinds of challenges that I think the Election Commission will have to take into account as they redraw lines in Sabah, Sarawak, and then also Peninsular Malaysia. Yeah. And of course, the Peninsular Malaysia case will be also tricky because of how the opposition, Perikatan Nasional, has been positioning the whole delimitation exercise. What they have come out to say, which I obviously do not agree with, is to say that this delimitation exercise will be done in a way that will benefit the non-Malay voters. Yeah. Because there are many seats in the urban areas that are non-Malay majority, and they would try to split up these seats to help DAP and maybe to help PKR. What is your response to that?
And this is done by our fellow political scientist, Dr. Mazuki, right?
Yes, he and also others as well in Perikatan Nasional.
True.
Yes,
okay.
Dr. Mazuki or Dr. Mazuki was the political secretary to Tan Sri Muhyiddin when he was Prime Minister.
Right.
Yeah. It's not political secretary, sorry, private secretary. Yes.
Right. Now come back to that issue. What the PN propaganda is that they're going to split seats, increase seats, and all those seats would be in the DAP area.
That's what they say. That's what some of them say.
Imagine that if we are not going to split the seats, and the EC chair is going to redraw the constituency fairly, plus minus 167,000, right? Bangi would have to be sliced into two. And then Sabah Benam, which has 51,000.
Maybe it may have to be merged with Tanjung Karang, for example.
And Sungai Besar, 65,000, they would have to be merged, right? So this is what they talk about. And that is what they want to frame to convince us everything is about ethnicity. Now, Kevin, let me ask you this question. Could you tell me the similarity between your former constituency, Bangi, with Seremban, with Tebrau, Sungai Petani, Tambun, and Indra Makota?
I think all these seats are seats that are relatively large, with more than 150,000 voters, and all of them are mixed constituencies, but with a Malay majority or plurality.
Spot on. They are actually all the largest in all the states. Now we think about 11 states plus Kuala Lumpur in the Semenanjung. This make up 6 of them, right? It defied this idea that when you have a big constituency, is the non-Malays who suffer, who experience underrepresentation. No. Because of urbanization, because of migrations from rural area to town, today you actually have Malays being the victims of malapportionment.
Yeah.
So your constituency, Bangi, why is it so large? Because you have a lot of university, right?
A lot of universities, a lot of developments, and a lot of Malay middle class, including civil servants that have moved there. We can say the same for a seat like Shah Alam,
Exactly.
60% Malay,
Yeah.
one of the largest in Malaysia and in Selangor as well.
Yeah.
And we can point to a lot of other Malay majority seats that are over 150,000 voters.
So what actually today when we talk about malapportionment is no longer inter-ethnic but intergenerational. So we have to unpack this idea. Let's imagine we have Siti Amira, a girl, very smart Malay girls from Sabah Benam.
Yep. You're referring to the Muda.
No. I'm just saying that simply throwing a name. Let's say you have a girl Amira from say
Sabah Benam.
Sabah Benam. She got into UKM. So because she was already 18, she originally was a voters in Sabah Benam. Now she transferred her registration
IC
to
UKM.
Bangi, right? What happened to her? Her political power would shrink by 83%.
From going to a smaller constituency in Sabah Benam to an urban constituency like Bangi,
Exactly.
both of which are Malay majority.
Exactly. Bangi is just about that, Malay plurality,
Above-
but going
above
to
50%, yes.
About 50%, going to majority maybe in another 5 years, right? But what happened to her is that in Sabah Benam, she shares a MP with 50,000 people. Now she goes to Bangi, she has to share it with 300,000 people, right? The attention she got, the power she could have in threatening her MP to say, fight for my interests, is much lesser. So when we talk about sustaining over-representation of Sabah Benam and under-representation of Bangi, we are saying that we want to punish young Malays so that their parents, their grandparents could have oversight. It's become an intergenerational issue.
There's also another issue here, which is again something that the Perikatan Nasional has not responsibly highlighted, which is the fact that there have been no parliamentary seat increases in the northern states of Kelantan, Terengganu, Perlis, and Kedah since 2003, if I'm not
2003.
mistaken. Because of that, you have seats like Baling, where there wasn't an increase in the number of parliamentary seats in Kedah, but the lines were redrawn to make Baling very big, very rural, and also a lot of voters. One of the largest seats in Kedah.
Yeah.
Right, so that's one example. Tumpat would be another one in Kelantan, also over 150,000. I think Tumpat maybe a bit more, but Bacho is quite high as well. So if you have a fair delimitation exercise, PAS will actually benefit from increase in the number of parliamentary seats.
Very good point, Keming. In order to do this, PAS have to fight with others Democrat for the restorations of 116. Because otherwise, you add seats, there's no guarantee you're going to get more seats. Now, just now I mentioned the two extreme cases next to each other. Selangor, the average size of voters a parliamentarian served in G15 was 167,000. In Pahang, 81,000. How could that happen? Because the last round, when 20 seats were added, Selangor were given only 5 instead of 10. Pahang, which does not deserve anything, were given 3, right? So if you're going to add seats based on changing Article 46 to what seats you get, again, would depends on negotiation. Doesn't reflect really the problem. And what the problem every time when we want to add seats is that our parliaments would get larger and larger. And unless we increase the time that parliamentarians sit, we effectively are employing more politicians to speak for lesser time.
Okay, so I think that's also an important point to make, because I think in the consciousness of the public, the notion that you can have a fixed number of seats, for example, but then you reallocate the seats between the states is something that I think some people are not comfortable with, because you end up with a situation where some states would lose seats.
Yeah.
Of course, that is something that is already normal in a place like the United States, for example, for their congressional representatives. When they have their own process of reallocating the seats, the number is fixed, right? The number is fixed at 438.
Yeah.
The minimum size, congressional seats that you can have, I think is 1.
Yeah.
And a large seat, and then you have 2 senators, right? So for some states, when they lose population, they can actually see a decrease in the number of seats.
It's actually very common. This process is called reapportionment. Reapportionment is objected by many Malaysians, both at the political class and ordinary people, for 2 different reasons. Political class basically see this as like the political job can only be created, cannot be destroyed, right? No way I would sign my retrenchment order. And for ordinary people, because they think that every MP is a ticket for demand allocation.
Certain
so
resources.
Come back to this.
Yep.
What we need to do is to resolve the mass needs. We have to find a way to make sure monies go to them, but not through the parliamentarian. Because if you use the parliamentarian as a middleman, it's not only unfair, but also some part of it may actually be lost in the process.
Okay, that's an important sort of like a point to highlight. Maybe on this part, we've spoken about a lot of different issues here.
Yeah.
I'd like to touch on 2 final issues. The first one is the issue of certain people asking for 1/3 of parliamentary seats to be allocated to Sabah and Sarawak. I know there may be a possibility that we would get James Chin to come here on this program later on to have a more thorough discussion with you on this. But I thought, to make this segment a bit more complete, maybe you'd like to share your viewpoints on what to make of this 1/3 of seats or 35% of seats allocated to Sabah and Sarawak.
Now, first thing that people like to claim this is in MA63, I can be very sure to tell that there's nothing mentioned in MA63. It was mentioned in the 1962 report by the Intergovernmental Committee, IGC. But what it says is that for 7 years after formation of Malaysia, the percentage of parliamentary seats for Sabah and Sarawak should stay the same unless for the increase for the admissions of the new states or with the concurrence of the state government. Now, if this idea is about veto power as they claim, why should there be a 7 years gap? It should have been permanent, right?
Okay.
So the real reason what happened was MA63, or the whole formation of Malaysia, was a very haphazard process. Singapore wants to marry Malaya. Malaya did not think that Singapore was a trouble woman, and therefore asked the mother-in-law UK and say, I would only take Singapore if you give me Sabah and Sarawak together.
To balance things out.
Yes, right? And so Singapore was underrepresented very badly. They have more populations than Sabah and Sarawak combined, but they only get 15 seats. Sabah and Sarawak each get 24 and 16.
40 seats in total.
40 seats in total. And Singapore accepted that raw deal in exchange for their autonomy in education, healthcare, and labor. And now, but they also have a common deal that say, okay, since Sabah and Sarawak trust Singapore more than Malaya, together they were given a block of 35%. Now that was an argument. Now come back to this. Now the claim that they made is that after Singapore left, Malaya took away the 15 seats. No, the number of the parliament was reduced from 159 to 144 and stayed that same number until 1973. So what happened was then in 1973, Semenanjung got another 10 seats through the seat increase process, right? So come back to this, there's no historical ground for that.
No basis.
No basis. Now, but what about democratic basis? Only in the upper house, not in the lower house. Why? Because that lower house is where government is formed. If we call ourselves democracy, then we have to apply the principles of political equalities of citizens, In other words, one person, one vote, one value. You have to have that. But what about states, right? What about smaller states? Aren't they treated as equal partner to each other? How do you protect them? We protect their interests by giving them overrepresentation in the upper house. What's the difference between the two? The lower house is your accelerator. You press and the car moves.
Okay.
The upper house is a brake. You press and it forces the car to stop and say what we need to do. In other words, upper house is a check and balance mechanism to force renegotiation, greater deliberations, and so on. So on that ground, it's legitimate for Sabah and Sarawak and Labuan together to get a one-third. But it was not provided in MA63. Now, not provided in MA63 simply means that we have to go for MA63 plus. MA63 should be the floor, not the ceiling of what we can do, right? That's why we propose for Sabah and Sarawak to get 35% in the upper house together with Labuan. How can that be done? Immediately you can do it because currently we have 70 seats. Every state have 2. So the East Malaysians have 5 over 70. If we add another 30 into the upper house, you get 100, and Sabah and Sarawak each would have 17 instead of 2, right? Together they have 35%. Now, then our friends from Sabah and Sarawak say, how can we trust them? The upper house has no legitimacy, no power. Now, the reason why they do not have power and so on is because they are unelected. To reform the upper house would take time. But if you really say you just want a constitutional veto, currently is enough. Because any constitutional amendment would have to have a 2/3 concurrence in both houses.
You still need to go through the upper house.
You still need to do that. And if you really don't trust the senators because they are appointed, right? You're basically saying that you don't trust Sabah and Sarawak state government to protect your interests. That's fine. What we can do is to have direct election for the 17 senators from Sabah and Sarawak alone. Why we are not talking about others? Because wholesale reform of the Senate would take times, right? So the question is that, do you want it immediately before GE16, before things change? Now, the last point that I want to make on this method is like, people are talking about 35%, but how do we get the number? Are you saying that we keep 2-2 and then take 21 seats from Semenanjung and give to Sabah and Sarawak?
I think Sabah and Sarawak would say you increase the number of seats, but whatever you increase is got to be done in such a way that we will end up with 35% of total seats.
So what it means, like let's say we start with just increased seats on Sabah and Sarawak, you have to add 32 seats for East Malaysia. After that, every 2 seats you increase here, 1 seat over there, right? If both sides increase the same seats,
you end up with 300.
360.
Okay.
So that's the situation. And without all this negotiation on where you get the seats to every state, that whether you get it through to Parliament, and you imagine that the PN would not be even happy of redrawing the constituency, would they accept a situation that you could have a simple majority government, 51%, with all 35% from Sabah and Sarawak and Labuan, and 16% from Semenanjung, right? If you get through that, then you have to redraw your constituency, so which means that Sabah and Sarawak would not possibly have veto power before GE16.
Okay, so maybe as a summary, final sort of like thought before I ask you the final question. What are the chances that this delimitation exercise for Peninsular Malaysia, would be able to be passed before GE16? More than 50% or less than 50%?
Definitely less than 50%. Okay. The main reason is because that if you're going to make it very fair, it would likely to become an ethnic issue. So the simple way for this government is actually to leave the delimitation aside and fix it institutionally by introduce party lists. So you add additional seats, and in adding the seats, you try to make sure that every state gets the same number. And because you are voting in on a statewide constituency.
So what Chin Huat is talking about is you add another vote. That would be one option whereby you vote for your local MP, and then you also vote for the party or the coalition that you want to be represented on a party list basis, where it is additional MPs to be added.
Yeah.
I think the chances of that happening before G16 is close to zero, because that will also involve a constitutional amendment. You also need the Council of Rulers to agree on this as well. So
Not actually Council of Rural, but I think main thing here is about...
In effect, you will need the Council of Rulers to to agree, because this is a major change in terms of how government is elected and formed.
Right.
Maybe just one last final question. You are no longer with Bersih. You are I think part of a new think tank called Sama.
Just an NGO.
Okay,
Sama,
NGO.
Sama.
Okay, and maybe you'd like to say a little bit about what Sama does, and I'll end by asking you about potential sort of like street protests.
For Sama, its full name is Project Stability and Accountability for Malaysia. We work on institutional reform, on issues from constitutional monarchy, parliamentary democracy, the rule of law, to federalism. So some of the things we talk about, we basically deal with this. We use a very pragmatic approach, trying to look for solution. So whatever issues, our response is not to find fault, but to say, how can we find solutions that get people to agree with? And that's how we position ourselves. We also have spent a little bit of our energies in dealing with culture war issues, like the KK Mart. Project Sama was the one who worked with Astro Awani to bring the media and NGOs to push for this, to launch the Maaf Zahir Batin campaign.
I am aware of that as a good initiative.
Yeah.
So, we've seen how Bersih have advocated for public protests over electoral reform issues in the past when BN was in power. There have been some attempts to put similar pressure on this government, although the public response has been quite tepid, very lukewarm. What would it take, do you think, for another Bersih movement to have momentum in terms of pushing for electoral reform?
Bersih movement or rally?
Bersih rally.
Bersih rally.
Or some sort of a public rally that includes different NGOs, including Bersih, maybe even Sama, to ask for institutional reform, especially in the area of electoral reform.
I do not think that would be a ground for a rally on institutional or electoral reform alone, because ultimately many people went to the street in the past with another idea in mind. You want to
change the government.
Yes. Right? So now that in a situation like this, the Madani supporters are not going to the street. And the opposition, when they want to go to the street, they are not talking about all this reform. They will be opposing fairer constituency delimitation, in fact, right? So that's not possible. But I would say that Bersih may go to the rally again. Of course, I'm not speaking for Bersih at all. But as an analyst, as
an interested observer,
I would say that Bersih may go to the street if Najib walk free. You used to say that that's a DAP red line, right? That DAP would not agree to stay in the government if Najib walk free. I'm not sure whether DAP keep to this, but I think a lot of Bersih supporters probably would think that if Najib walks free, then people should walk too.
If, let's say, for the sake of argument, let's say tomorrow the rest of the 1MDB and SRC related cases are DNAA, and then there's a push by this government for Najib to be pardoned. I don't think that that's going to happen. I don't think this is the approach that the Madani government is taking. There's other reasons for why I think both Anwar and Zahid may prefer Najib to be in his current predicament, but that's for another discussion. So basically what you're trying to say is that more or less status quo. There will be no big electoral reform push on the part of the voters and also for the government. And the delimitation exercise is likely to take place or conclude after the next general election with maybe not that much changes in terms of the process compared to the past.
The second part, I beg to disagree a bit. I think whether or not we will see changes, more reform in the remaining terms of this Madani government depends on whether Anwar would buy insurance or buy lottery. You buy lottery when you think your luck is good. You're going to win big, so you're not going to change anything, right? You buy insurance because you expect there to be rainy days, you may lose and so on. So instead of losing everything, you want to make sure that to cover yourself. Now, if this government doesn't get stronger, I think we would see more reform. Contrary to some people's argument that this government cannot deliver reform because it's too weak, because it's in a coalition government, put the blame on UMNO and say no. This government would deliver less reform if we feel that it's comfortable.
It's comfortable. And I agree with that sentiment because we saw the delivery of some institutional reform, including equal parliamentary allocation, including constitutional amendments to stop party hopping, at least in a limited fashion, when Ismail Sabri was at his weakest.
Exactly.
When he took over from Muhyiddin and he knew that he needed the votes of the Pakatan Harapan MPs in order to stabilize his government. So perhaps if, let's say, there is a situation approaching GE16 where this Madani government feels a bit more vulnerable, then maybe the impetus to want to include or introduce some sort of a political financing act or parliamentary allocation act to protect itself as an insurance policy, that would be higher.
Exactly.
Yeah. So we'll see. G16 is still another 3 years away. So it's still a long time, and a lot of things can happen in politics.
To have more reform, we probably need another hung parliament. I love to see hung parliament continuing. Japan just have a hung parliament now.
Well, we'll see. Right now, I think the Madani government is quite comfortable, but we do not know what the political configurations would be like in 2026 or 2027. Thank you so much, Chin Huat. Any final words that you want to pass to the audience in terms of how they should keep this government and also the opposition accountable to the public?
Ultimately, voters should not buy this fetish for unity. If politicians get united, it would be like a situations where your lotuses, your Maidin,
all the grocery stores become one.
And then
there's no competition.
There's no sales at all. So we should not be divided and ruled by the politician. We should endeavor to divide and rule the politician.
And hopefully the politicians will compete on things of greater policy substance and maybe less so on things which divide us in ways that are not so healthy. Thank you so much, and we'll be right back next week, and hopefully Peter will be here together as well. See you then.